Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar. We got a good one for you. Today we're talking with three experts about geopolitics and how it could impact your portfolio. And not only that, we're going to dive deep into a fascinating ETF that provides investors exposure to 14 technologies that are critical to the future of the US. Stick around because this is going to be a great webinar. So let's get into it. Joining me today are Amanda Rabello, Head of Xtrackers Sales for U.S. Onshore, Nick Crociata, Product Specialist for U.S. Xtrackers, and Brett Mahoney, Principal at J.H. Whitney Investment Management. Brett, obviously we got Amanda and Nick from Xtrackers here. That kind of makes you the odd man out. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your firm, J.H. Whitney, as well?
Yeah, I'll just get by. So I'm a principal here at J.H. Whitney, and I'm also a chief operating officer of an entity called Whitney Strategic Services, which is actually a cleared defense contractor. My background is I was an intelligence officer in the United States Navy, and then I was a threat analyst and a mission planner at a three-letter agency before attempting to run as far and fast from government as humanly possible, and did the traditional MBA, University of Chicago, Deutsche Bank investment banking route, before really kind of getting off the wrong elevator, I guess, and ending up in a firm that really does two things primarily. We do direct investments in early stage companies around the themes of emerging technologies that have dual use purposes, as for a military use as well as a civilian use. We also, as I mentioned, are a cleared defense contractor, so we have we're cleared up to a level of TS and above, and we do advisory work for the Department of Defense, U.S. Air Force, and various elements of the intelligence agencies, and how we kind of got in our sort of latest effort, it really comes out of those two lines, which is the development of an index that we were fortunate enough to partner with DWS on, to do a couple things that we'll kind of get into in the course of the discussion. But yeah, that's what makes us the odd man out. So it's fun to be here on this platform, and very different from my day job. I guess you could call it that.
That's great. Looking forward to hearing more from you, Brett. But first, Amanda, I want to turn to you. I know a lot of people watching right now, they're tuning in because they want to learn about the geopolitical landscape and how it affects their portfolios. And we're definitely going to get into specifics, but why don't we start by having you give us some insights on how you and your company look at geopolitics and geopolitical risks from an investment perspective?
Thanks, Sumit. So I would say that DWS, as a German headquartered asset manager who operates globally, so here in the US, but also in Asia and in Europe, of course, we're very privileged that we get a lot of insight from our local experts as well as from our investors too. It also means that we're getting a lot of questions from our investors. And so to that end, we have a lot of in-house experts who are opining on geopolitical matters simply because they shape macro asset allocation quite significantly. So I would highlight in particular Frank Kelly, who is our DWS senior political strategist. He's actually based in Washington, DC, and he's just put his first blog post out for the year. And really it's led with the Taiwanese presidential election, which is taking place on the 13th of January. That's obviously key in terms of the ongoing tensions between China and Taiwan in East Asia. He's also commentated on the Israel-Hamas situation as well this week, and then additionally the Houthi rebels and their activity in the Red Sea and how this is disrupting global commercial shipping. Also, we put out our 10 key themes for the year ahead in November last year. That came from our global CIO, Bjorn Yesh. And amongst the 10 themes, really there was an undercurrent of how geopolitics is shaping really the world going forward. It's a much more heightened consideration than it has been in recent years. And I would say that both of these individuals are very much leveraging all of our global colleagues from the global portfolio management side, as well as our macroeconomists.
Absolutely. A lot of attention on geopolitics, especially over the past 2 years, Brent. It's been extremely eventful from a geopolitical standpoint. We've seen conflicts erupt in Ukraine, Israel, the Red Sea, the list goes on. Could you give us a broad overview of the geopolitical landscape as you see it today?
Yeah, happy to. I know we only have an hour, and that's probably a 10-hour, 2-week conversation with everything. So this is my sort of overview is going to be dramatic oversimplification. But if you try to think of of the world in sort of 4 buckets, you have Chinese communism, you have Russian revanchism, you have political Islam, and then you sort of have this liberal democracy as defined. We'll leave out narcotics and some of the other kind of emerging economy pieces for the sake of this conversation. But ironically, they're also, if you look at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence publishes every year its annual threat reporting. The 4 countries it lists as the greatest threat to the United States and its allies are China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And surprisingly, North Korea has been the quietest one of all the last couple of years, which is a kind of a big change. But if you just kind of go around in those 4 buckets, as Amanda mentioned, you have CTF, Combined Task Force 53, which is currently working on Operation Prosperity Guardian. So you really have an emboldened Iranian Guard Corps. So the missiles are the Noor missiles, which is a variant of the Chinese 802 that is usually comes through supplied by the Iranian Guard Corps Navy. But it really an emboldened Guard Corps that's kind of taken advantage of sort of wallet net system, cryptocurrencies, and they've been much more active in the area, a lot of times in response to other events that have taken place. You just and keep going around. Then you have the war in Ukraine, which is incredibly interesting from a third-party onlooker perspective. You have commercial capabilities used in a military setting. You have a sort of a war of attrition in terms of munitions and supplies. Keep going around that list. Over in China, I don't know if you saw Xi Jinping's New Year's speech. 2 powerful themes coming out of that. One, the reunification of Taiwan. It's going to be the 75th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. He also reiterated or congratulated technological achievements related to China's Made in China 2025 policy. That's these are the 10 industries which China believes it needs to be the leader in order to return China to the China 2049 dream of the global power of the world, essentially. And then, as Amanda mentioned, you have sort of 2 major elections coming up. One very soon, where Taiwan, you have the DPP. Looks like they're they're in the lead. I'm a terrible predictor of elections, so I don't even want to step on that landmine. And then you have the sort of U.S. election coming up as well, which again is probably a 15-hour debate or argument, and I have no idea how that's going to go. The one thing I will say, though, on the U.S. side, is in terms of U.S. foreign policy, towards China, Russia, and that a lot of the policies that began 2017 under the previous administration really carried over under the current Biden administration. So whether we have a second Biden administration or whether we have Trump 2.0 or other Republican or third party, or I have no idea how this is going to go. It's too crazy. But what you do see, I think, is agreement in Washington, on one topic only, and that is kind of the global threat picture. What the particular responses are. There's some nuances in there, but it's a pretty unified view. And so that's just kind of a ground overview. But what does it mean to investors is really the kind of the big question. And what it really means to investors is the sort of global economic system that began really as a Pax Americana after the Second World War. So if you think of the Bretton Woods system, where economic security as a form of national security was put in place, we're going to bind the world to global norms of a Western liberal economy. This is going to provide for prosperity to all. Being bound under one system will ensure, Western U.S. security. And it's going to snowballs into, if you think of things like Francis Fukuyama in 1992, he writes, the end of history and the last man, saying that Western democracy is the end all be all, is the last form of government. And you look at sort of U.S. foreign policy, really from post Second World War, 1970s, all the way through 2010, really looking at sort of how it handles China and other emerging economies. It's, engage, bind, and bound. We're going to engage them on global issues of, the climate, waste, energy security. We are going to bind them to global norms, the World Trade Organization, WHO, a lot of these other UN, NATO, et cetera, et cetera. And then we're going to engage, bound with a strategic offset, which is a superior over-the-horizon military capability. Well, that whole model is really been disrupted. And I don't think Xi Jinping ever read Francis Fukuyama, or maybe he did, because, he famously said, we're communism, but with Chinese characteristics. And so you really have this ingrained military civil fusion and in China, and you see the rest of the world kind of very reactionary to a lot of these domestic, command and control economic policies. And so what it really means for investors is business as usual, the sort of the free flow of goods, ideas, services is really going to be disrupted. The Red Sea is what is instance right now. It's kind of a revamp of back when I was a young junior officer serving over there doing the counter piracy mission. If you recall, we again had the issue of Bab el Mandeb. We had to send ships around, Horn of Africa. Maersk announcing the same thing. I think they're charging an extra $700 per TEU. That's the equivalent. That's a 20-foot container on a ship. So you have these supply chain, and you have these policy disruptions, and companies historically have benefited from this, free flow of goods and services without hindrance, and have been able to sort of straddle multiple systems at the same time. And that's really come under fire in the last, since in 2015, Made in China 2025 comes around. 2017, China implements a national security law. There are other policies like the Chinese data law that says if you're operating in China, all the data you build and generate has to be in country. There's the anti-foreign sanctions law, which says if you comply with a sanction from a foreign government that is of hindrance to PRC, you're in violation of the law here. And even for domestic companies, we saw the impact of policy on sort of the Chinese tech industry. And so you have more and more of this disruption, caused by geopolitics, independent of the fundamental analysis of the company itself. It's P&L, it looks good, it's, beta, sort of traditional financial metrics, but you have these previously thought of black swan events that are really going to be more of the norm. Countries are going to continue to implement these ring fences around their supply chains and their domestic industries. And so companies are going to have a very, very difficult time in operating in multiple systems. And so you're at this kind of bridge where where company leadership is going to have to decide, what is the risk if operating in this country? What is the risk operating in this country? Can I do both? If I can't, what are the decisions that have to be made?
That's a really helpful breakdown, Brett. Now, a lot of investors listening right now, they hear what you're saying about this paradigm shift, essentially, and they see these scary geopolitical headlines, but they're not quite sure how all of this impacts their investments. As I understand it, at JH Whitney, you've come up with a way to actually quantify these geopolitical risks. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so one of the things we developed was a system we call a geostrategic risk rating. And so the geostrategic risk rating was a way to try to quantify any publicly traded company's degree of, we call, entanglement risk with an adversarial country. And it's adversarial, in this case, we're looking through a U.S. lens as defined by the Office Director of National Intelligence. And if you think about a company and the companies and their reporting, you look at sort of three kind of primary components: is what's the company's governance, what's their commercial activities, and then what are their operational activities. And so if you read a lot of sort of traditional, risk reporting, if you look at, what's the risk factor of China or South Africa, you get things of corruption risk, maybe low, the economy, the currency is stable, civil war is low, but it doesn't well down to what is the risk of an individual company's exposure. And this model was really built out of a project that we had done for the Department of Defense with the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. And that's the agency responsible for delivering or administering security clearances to companies. And what they look for is elements of what they call FOCI, foreign ownership, control, and influence. Traditionally, in the past, you think of the traditional thought behind that was, well, if you're 51% owned by, a foreign entity, that's bad, but that was kind of where the end of it goes. As we, understand with the development of data and, more transparency reporting, there are a lot more factors that can influence a company. Are you dependent upon a supply chain, in Russia, China, Iran, North Korea? What happens if there's, we worked at one time with a very large insurance company, had significant losses when Russia went into Ukraine on their debt portfolio. Everything on their analysis said, low risk of non-repayment. Didn't factor into what happens if U.S. sanctions come down and those companies physically can't move capital. And so, what's a way to tease this out in a portfolio or looking at an individual security? And this was really sort of developed as as a response to, if you think of competition globally now as sort of whole of society competitions, where technology is an area of competition, but also capital is an area of competition. governments have tools to handle geopolitical conflict. Companies themselves have tools to handle geopolitical conflict. Mayors can run the analysis and say, well, okay, we're going to go around to Africa, but individual investors or those that can move capital didn't really have a tool handy to be able to kind of evaluate this risk. And so what we did was quite simply looking at those three kind of primary components. If we can look at multiple components underneath them, such as, where do the board something like board composition, who's on your board of directors, what are their other business relationships, you have a degree of entanglement. And so on a 1 to 3 scale, 3 is a low risk company, 1 is a high risk company, and we score each one of these sub factors. And then, in the case of working with DWS, we will implement it into an investment product, but it's been utilized in multiple iterations and with multiple lenses. A fairly obvious case study if you look at something like Apple, where they have, at this point now, almost 20% of their revenue coming from China, as well as the assets and supply chain and joint venture, where they have a risk of intellectual property transfer. If you have incidents where China announces, and they did do this, that no party member shall have an iPhone in China, and well, if you believe the military, if you look at military civil fusion, and you say, okay, well, in terms of social credit or social engineering, if you have an iPhone as a Chinese citizen, you're out of step with party leadership. The timing of that announcement just happens to be almost perfectly timed with the announcement of Huawei, the domestic champion's new iPhone launch. If 20% of your business or your assets is at risk because of government policy decision, am I being compensated for that risk? And Apple's a pretty obvious example, but there are other subtle examples where you have something like a U.S. company. It has U.S. U.S. ownership. It has some U.S. manufacturing, but it has dependency in these other factors, either in their R&D or in their supply chain, that bring up a risk, method of bring it to a level of I'd say discussion about, is the risk worth it, or am I prepared for one of these black swan events? And that's what we try to bring to the conversation with DWS.
Super interesting. Amanda, I want to bring you back into the conversation. Obviously, you're at Xtrackers, and you recently launched a new ETF called the Xtrackers US National Critical Technologies ETF, ticker symbol CRTC. I want to dive deeper into this fund. It's a brand new fund, like I said, having launched just a few months ago. But before we get into the details, Amanda, can you tell us why you decided to launch this ETF?
Yeah, absolutely. So, linked to what I was speaking about before, and, we at DWS can kind of see that the geopolitical landscape is changing. I think, really nations are trying to vie for more influence domestically. And also, we all saw, right? We all experienced the failures in supply chain with the pandemic. I think all of us can see that energy provision has been quite tough with the Russia-Ukraine situation as well, also food supply as well. So the US government kind of always continues to think about this very much, right? That's why we're electing them, to think about maintaining our kind of economic and societal situation. But I think what we're seeing now is that actually actually you see emerging powers which have actually emerged already. So, I think the US still continues to be the leader of the free world, but there are definitely some nations which are clipping at our tail, definitely. And so here at DWS, we kind of, more broadly think that thematic ETFs are something where we want to expand our range at Xtrackers. So we also launched our US Green Infrastructure ETF. We launched our US Cybersecurity ETF, and then also our Semiconductors ETF. So the tickers for these are UPGR, chips and password. And with critical technology, we think about kind of overarching themes. So you can think about individual themes, but also we understand that some investors might want to package these all together. I think when we think about critical technologies, working with Brett and his colleagues at Whitney, what we really got to understand when we were speaking about with them was really the emergence and the definition of these critical technologies. So the Department of Defense has actually identified 14 critical technologies, critical and emerging technologies, they call them. We try to keep the name of the fund a little bit more concise, though. And really what these are a subset of advanced technologies, which the US Department of Defense thinks will help to maintain kind of the level of and standard of life that we all have, the level of security we have as well from a national perspective. And we can kind of think about these in three different families. So first of all, emerging opportunity areas. So we're looking at biotechnology, quantum science, advanced materials, future generation wireless technology. Then also when we look at the other two segments, so there's effective adoption areas, so that's advanced computing and software, space technology. So great to see the news already that we've kind of like are back in that space in the US. Renewable energy and storage, integrated networks, microelectronics, trusted AI, which we all see as vitally important, and then also human machine interfaces. And then last but not least, actually maybe surprisingly for some investors and some viewers today, there's only 3 defense-specific areas that have been defined by the Department of Defense within this critical technologies space. So it's hypersonics, directed energy, and also cyber. If we think about really, why these are important, I think, we can just already think about all of us, from a personal level, but also we know from a corporate level as well. Cyber attacks are really, posing a threat to revenue streams and profitability of a number of companies. We see that the average cost of data breaches has increased by 170% from 2006 to 2022. So then obviously that cost has to come out of the profits of a company. And therefore, when we think about valuation of stocks, that's obviously at a detriment. So companies which are maybe better positioned against that can be a better investment case. Also, when we think about trusted AI as well, I think all of us have varying levels of skepticism around artificial intelligence, but we all see the benefits of it as well. We do see that the trusted AI component is really important because we already see, malicious intent with AI more broadly. And then last but not least, it could be from like an 80s like Russian spy saga or something. But, biotechnology is still vitally important because we do still know that there's weaponization potentially of things like anthrax, botulism, yellow fever, and so forth. So we do still need to consider these areas as well. What we were trying to do with CRTC, so working with Whitney and with Solactive in trying to replicate this index, is ultimately to provide US investors with our 40X platform to provide, an access vehicle. So at Xtrackers, we're always thinking about providing investors with innovation, access, and value. Here we're looking to innovate. I think it's a very compelling exposure, provide access to a key theme that we're reading about on a daily basis. I would actually kind of deem it like a mega theme. So we've seen a lot of flows going into things like artificial intelligence, intelligence, biotech, cybersecurity ETFs more recently. But actually, I think investors, when they're going into that, are really just trying to go into this broader theme. So we think we can help there. And then value as well. So we're priced very competitively at 35 basis points. I think when you look at the broader thematic space, that's actually super, super interesting.
This list is currently held by the Office of Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. And this really goes back to 2017, where the concept of economic security as national security. So as Amanda mentioned, you look at these and only 3 of these being defense specific. But really, if you look at these technologies, they are the drivers of the new economy, the sort of the future economy. And you look at, if you think of the world in sort of the us versus them, or West versus East, or just in terms of reshoring these technologies, who's going to be the global leader in these technologies, and who's going to have the economic security that's driven by leadership in these technologies. And so the interesting thing from a sort of a perspective of, both an investor, and a defense contractor, a lot of these technologies are not in the traditional, you think of large prime contractors of Lockheed, Boeing. Certainly they're there. Hypersonic, that's a hard one. That's a hard one to build for AT&T. No offense to AT&T. But you look at things like artificial intelligence or these cloud technologies. Cloud is critical to the future of DoD and how we fight, abroad. You're going to see a lot of very non-traditional companies, be invited into space. And one of the things we've been working with research and engineering for is creating new contract vehicles to take advantage of the increased spending that's coming down the pipeline in R&D, in research and development, and in a new contracting vehicle that will enable non-traditional companies or companies that have never worked with the Department of Defense before to build on these technologies.
I think one thing that's also worth mentioning as well, my accent's a dead giveaway. We've called the fund US National Critical Technologies, but there's actually a lot of alignment with other NATO partners as well. So we see as well kind of similar activity, similar kind of defined lists as well, coming from a lot of the Western European countries as well. So there is some overlap. This is kind of a global theme more broadly. The world, and a number of the superpowers globally are all moving in the same direction.
Certainly sounds like an interesting ETF. Amanda, I know this is an index-based fund. I love it, if you could tell us a little bit more about the index. What is the methodology, and how do those geopolitical risk scores that Brett talked about earlier play into it?
Yeah, sure. So we rely very heavily on IP that's coming from Brett and the team, and great to have collaborated on yet another fund with Solactive in terms of index provision. So, the starting point is the global equity universe. And so, we would consider the parent index for the benchmark that we're looking to track here as the Solactive GBS Developed Markets Large and Mid Cap Index. So just consider it a large and mid-cap global developed equity index. So from that starting point of 1,559 names, we then applied the critical technology screen. So looking at all the different sector codes, basically, and subsector codes, we can map to these 14 categories that we've just identified, and then we end up with a basket. That's around 576 names as of the last rebalance. So we've already, kind of ended up with a subset which is about a third of the original starting point. And then what we do is that we look at the geostrategic risk ratings, which are coming from Whitney. So Brett can go into more detail, but ultimately this is based on exposure to adversarial nations from a US perspective. So China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And then also it's kind of like looking through 3 different lenses at 10 different factors, things like, board representation, things like revenue streams, things like, perfect example was what Brett was talking about with Apple before. And then we have this scale, which is up to 3 maximum. And then any companies within that 576 constituent list, which has a GRR, which is above 2.3, then we can include them in the index. And then we end up with a portfolio for tracking all of the constituents of 247 constituents. What's interesting to know is that we call this a thematic product, but in reality, it's actually got a very high correlation to the S&P 500. So it's around 97%. That's very largely driven by the fact that about 80% of the portfolio ends up being US equities, but there are also obviously global stocks as well in that remainder.
It sounds like a compelling ETF, Amanda. What is the investment case, though, for CRTC? Is it like a growth story? Is it a hedge against geopolitical risks? What would an investor, why would an investor buy this type of ETF?
Yeah, so I think the way I think about it is I think there's 4 main reasons to consider CRTC. We can discuss these first, and then we can maybe move on a little bit into where can it sit in a portfolio. But I would say ultimately we can summate it as, we've got shifting global dynamics. We've also got, ultimately the backing from a bipartisan perspective in terms of, the rationale and the definition of these technologies. Also, the opportunity to monetize, the consequence of this bipartisan priority, which will be increased technology spending. And then last but not least, kind of what I was alluding to before, taking a streamlined approach to accessing this theme more broadly. We can dive in a little bit more briefly. We all know that the global economic system has typically been much more like Western dominated, but obviously the world is changing. We think about China, but actually we should be thinking about India as well. It's kind of the darling in so many global bank views for 2024 and beyond. Also worth considering as well. Now this is going to be the largest democracy voting this year as well. And then we also have kind of this trend, which started with the pandemic really, was already kind of in motion, but I think the pandemic really accelerated it, which is kind of the onshoring theme becoming the new norm. So, semis is a great example, right? The US is trying to be more dependent on semiconductor supply chains, which kind of originate within the US rather than looking at ex-US supply chains. We all saw this with, like the manufacturing of cars, right? That was like a consequence of the supply chain problems with semiconductors, something that we're all very reliant on. Coming back to from a government priority perspective, we've got the election in the US, but it's very clear that both lead parties, we're backing things like the CHIPS Act, for example, but also remember as well the Build Back Better concept as well. So in terms of infrastructure spend, which is kind of like intrinsically linked into a lot of the critical technologies as well. We touched on things like energy provision, for example. This would be within that. Then it's very clear that that will continue to be a priority in whichever government ends up winning the election. But I think it's going to be a very heavy point within, the manifestos of the 2 lead parties as well for 2024. Let's see who the candidates are, but I think that's one thing that we can be certain on. And then, there has already been kind of commitment to further spend within these areas. So, I think, it's very visible that the US is now more broadly thinking about space exploration again, things like this. Also, we see as well that for 2024, the Department of Defense has requested a budget of $842 billion. That we'll see how much is going to get granted, but quite a significant amount of that was allocated towards these 14 critical technologies. And then just when we think about, last but not least, like taking this streamlined approach, I would say that the critical technology ETF that we've built, CRTC, is, like I said, a kind of mega theme sort of ETF. So instead of an investor having to think about, oh, do I want to allocate 10% or 20% to cybersecurity? Do I want to allocate 1% or 2% to semiconductors? This is sort of a one-stop shop, really, for buying into that broader view that I think quite a lot of us have.
Amanda, I'm looking now, and the fund has roughly $5 million in assets under management. Correct me if I'm wrong. So what does that mean in terms of liquidity, in terms of tradability, and the ability for investors to get in and out of the ETF?
Yeah, great question. So I think always, as with all ETFs when they're starting out, we're typically in the seed capital. And, I think ETFs more broadly, we tend to look at the on-screen liquidity, thinking about, investors going in and out in the secondary market. When we think about a fund that has just been launched recently, it's always good to be thinking about the primary market and the underlying level of liquidity. So whilst you might see an ADV of X and 30-day average bid-offer spread of Y, I think with new funds, it's not always the full picture. And especially with this one, when we consider that 80% of the holdings are in US large cap and mid cap, in reality, we can make a deduction then that, executable bid-offer spread is probably broadly similar to like S&P 500. So like within 2 basis points if we're in US trading hours. So I think, the product, we have high conviction in terms of the liquidity that's available.
Nick, I want to bring you into the conversation now. Obviously, Amanda, she covered how the portfolio is constructed. But can you touch on what the actual composition of the portfolio is? What are the top holdings, for instance, of the ETF today?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks, Sumit. I think when people hear the name of the fund, Xtrackers, U.S. National Critical Technologies, they tend to think that this is going to be a technology fund in the traditional sense, right? Meaning that they expect that the portfolio composition is going to be allocated almost entirely to information technology names. However, that's not actually the case. For example, if you look at this slide, specifically the corresponding GIG sector classifications that each of the top 10 holdings of CRTC is mapped to, you'll see that 6 out of the 10 top names are mapped to GIG sectors other than that of information technology. Alphabet, communication services, Amazon, consumer discretionary, ExxonMobil and Chevron Energy, ABB and Merck, healthcare. So, by no means is this exclusively an information technology fund. If you go to the next slide, we could also look into this a little bit more granularly. If you look at the chart on the right-hand side of the slide, you see that CRTC's sector breakdown is actually quite diverse. Yes, information technology is the most represented sector, accounting for 32% of the portfolio. But after that, you have 10 other sectors accounting for the remaining 68% of the portfolio, with healthcare, communication services, and industrials leading the charge. The question would be, why is this the case? This is the case because technologies in the context of the Xtrackers U.S. National Critical Technologies ETF, or CRTC, are not exclusively traditional technologies, but rather, as I like to put it, activities or sets of activities that help to secure the longevity of the United States and allow the nation to maintain its position as a leader on the world stage. So yes, the fund is labeled as critical technologies, but I also think it could be looked at as, a critical activities fund.
What about the geographic composition of the portfolio, Nick? Are these mostly U.S. companies in the ETF?
Yeah, so and in a similar vein to the sector composition, I find that the geographic composition of CRTC also tends to surprise investors. As you can see in the chart on the left-hand side of the slide, the fund is not entirely allocated to domestic U.S. names as one might expect. Yes, naturally, the United States constitutes a significant portion of the names in the portfolio, around 86 to 87%. But there are several other nations that are represented in the fund. And this goes back to the underlying methodology that Amanda described and the geostrategic risk rating that Brett described. You know, that's what critical tech is built on, and it permits companies from allied nations that help to progress and to develop the critical capabilities of the US to also be included in the underlying index and therefore the portfolio. It should also be noted that, you know, those companies that contribute to the ongoing development of our nation's critical capabilities do not necessarily need to be domiciled in the US. So that's why you're seeing this portfolio that's actually somewhat diverse in terms of its geographic composition, not entirely allocated to US names. It can be names from other regions, other countries.
And part of that that piece is, if you look at the U.S. has various intelligence sharing agreements with countries we call, the Five Eyes, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, et cetera. So in the terms of the construction of the GRR, those countries hold just as an equal weight to the United States in terms of having a low risk value. And also, as Nick mentioned, you see the diversification across the industry sectors. A lot of these, companies like, as Nick mentioned, Amazon, you think of Amazon as a consumer, online platform. But for the context of national critical technologies, it's really, we're looking at, it's AWS and their secure cloud contracts that they hold with the Department of Defense that are critical to some of the programs that are coming on the Department of Defense. So a lot of times in the methodology, we have companies that they identify, as a consumer company, but really in their underlying activities or in their other disclosed activities, or we look at the Department of Defense or their government contracting data, we can see their other activities in these critical technologies, and that's grounds for inclusion in the index.
Gotcha. So, Nick, I know a lot of people watching right now, they probably find the investment case for CRT pretty compelling, but they're also wondering, how can a fund like this be used, or how can it fit inside of their existing portfolio? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I like to believe that CRTC is very much a Swiss Army knife within the ETF market. Critical tech is a very versatile fund that could be used differently depending upon what a client's objective is. We've seen many use cases be implemented already. First, we've seen critical tech be used as an alternative to an existing core holding, particularly the S&P 500. The rationale behind that, and Amanda alluded to this previously, is that the correlation between CRTC and the S&P 500 is around 97%. So there's significant overlap between the two funds. We've also seen CRTC be used as a satellite alpha generator in a traditionally oriented portfolio. Reason being that CRTC provides investors exposure to many themes and sectors like AI, cybersecurity, 5G wireless technologies, etc. All areas that have had very high growth and are projected to continue to experience outsized growth in the market. And then lastly, we've seen critical tech be used as a risk tool. The use of the geostrategic risk rating allows investors to reduce unnecessary geopolitical risk within their portfolio that they're not being compensated for. And Brett briefly mentioned that as well. So I guess my answer would be that CRTC is an incredibly versatile fund. It serves multiple purposes, and how it should be implemented into a portfolio will differ between clients. And it's entirely dependent upon what a client objective is. So, you have three key use cases we've seen it implemented for each of those use cases. And I guess my answer is it's very versatile. It's very much a Swiss Army knife here in the market.
We're just about out of time, Nick. Do you have any other comments before we wrap this up? Yeah,
I would just say that CRTC is a very compelling opportunity. I think it's a unique fund in the market that's incorporating tools that aren't currently being utilized by any other ETF out there. And it's backed by three incredibly talented teams: the DWS Xtrackers team, which is our side, Selective on the indexing side, and Whitney on the geostrategic risk rating side. As a reminder, this fund was listed on the NYSE on November 16th, 2023, at an expense ratio of 35 bips, which I believe is an incredibly fair price point for all that the fund is providing.
Fantastic. We're going to have to leave it there. Nick, Amanda, Brett, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. Thanks so much for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And a big thank you to everyone tuning in today. A replay of this webinar will be available on demand in the Media Center section of the ETF.com website. Have a great day and see you next time.